The old farmhouse creaked in the morning wind as I stood on the porch, holding the deed in my trembling hands. My grandfather's property stretched before me, 200 acres of prime farmland in the heart of Nebraska. The cornfields swayed gently, and the red barn stood proudly against the horizon like a monument to decades of hard work. I had never imagined inheriting all this. Growing up in the city, I'd only visited during summers, helping Grandpa with small chores while dreaming of returning to my comfortable apartment. But here I was, 28 years old, unemployed after the latest tech layoffs, staring at what felt like both an opportunity and an overwhelming responsibility. The lawyer had been clear about the conditions. I had to work the land for at least 2 years, or the property would be sold and the proceeds donated to charity. Grandpa wanted to ensure his legacy continued, not just got cashed in by some ungrateful city kid. My neighbor, Jake Morrison, leaned against the fence separating our properties. He was everything I wasn't. Experienced, weathered by years of farm work, and clearly amused by my predicament. His family had farmed the adjacent land for 3 generations, and he'd made no secret of his interest in buying my grandfather's property if I failed. "City boy's gonna learn real quick that farming ain't like playing video games," he'd told the other locals at Morrison's feed store just yesterday. Word traveled fast in small towns. I folded the deed carefully and slipped it into my jacket pocket. Whatever happened, I was determined to prove him wrong. This land meant something. It was my grandfather's life's work, and I wouldn't let it slip away without a fight. The morning sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the fields that were now mine to tend. The first month nearly broke me. Every muscle in my body ached from dawn to dusk as I struggled to understand the rhythm of farm life. Grandpa's old John Deere tractor became my greatest nemesis, a temperamental beast that seemed to know I was an imposter. I'd watched YouTube videos until my eyes burned, trying to learn everything from proper irrigation techniques to crop rotation schedules. The local feed store became my second home, where I'd hover near conversations between real farmers, hoping to absorb their wisdom through osmosis. Jake Morrison made frequent appearances, always with that knowing smirk that made my blood boil. He'd offer unsolicited advice wrapped in barely concealed condescension. "You're flooding that section," he'd call out from his side of the fence. "Corn doesn't like wet feet, city boy." Despite my pride, I had to admit he was often right. The man knew farming like I knew computer code, instinctively, with years of experience guiding every decision, but his attitude made accepting help nearly impossible. Mrs. Henderson from the general store took pity on me, occasionally bringing by casseroles and practical advice. She'd known my grandfather well and seemed genuinely invested in my success. Her kindness was a bright spot in those difficult early weeks. The corn was struggling in the east field, and I suspected the irrigation system needed major repairs. The estimate from the equipment company made my stomach drop. $15,000 I didn't have. My savings were dwindling faster than I'd anticipated, and harvest season was still months away. Late at night, I'd sit on the porch with Grandpa's old account books, trying to make sense of the numbers. The farm had been profitable, but barely. One bad season could wipe out years of careful planning. Jake's laughter carried across the fields some evenings, mixing with the sounds of his efficient operation. His equipment was newer, his fields more productive. Sometimes I wondered if he was right. Maybe I was just a city boy playing farmer. 3 months in, disaster struck. A spring storm rolled across the plains with the fury of nature unleashed, bringing hail the size of golf balls and winds that bent the corn stalks nearly horizontal. I stood helplessly in the doorway of the barn, watching months of work get destroyed in 20 minutes. When the storm passed, I walked through the devastated fields in stunned silence. The corn that had been shoulder-high just hours before now lay flattened and broken. The financial implications hit me like a physical blow. Crop insurance would cover some losses, but not enough, not nearly enough. Jake appeared at the fence line, surveying the damage to his own fields. His crops had taken a beating too, but his operation was large enough to absorb the loss. Mine wasn't. "Tough break, neighbor," he called out, but there was something different in his voice. Almost sympathetic? First year's always the hardest. That evening I called my old college roommate in Denver. The tech industry was booming again, and he had job leads that could get me back on my feet financially. The smart move was obvious. Sell the farm, cut my losses, and return to the life I understood. But as I stood in Grandpa's kitchen, surrounded by his photographs and memories, something stubborn inside me refused to surrender. These walls had sheltered 3 generations of my family. The land outside had fed countless families and communities. It deserved better than my first-year failures. I spent the night researching drought-resistant crops and government assistance programs for beginning farmers. There had to be a way forward that didn't involve giving up. By morning, I had a plan, risky and requiring every penny of my remaining savings, but possible. The replanting would be expensive, and I'd need to find additional income to survive until harvest. Mrs. Henderson mentioned that the local school needed someone to teach basic computer skills to adults. It wasn't much, but combined with some freelance web design work, it might be enough. Jake watched from his porch as I fired up the tractor for another round of field preparation. This time, I was planting hope, along with the seeds. By midsummer, the replanted fields were showing promise. The corn wasn't as tall as it should have been, but it was healthy and growing steadily. My computer classes at the local community center had become surprisingly popular, bringing in enough income to keep the lights on and groceries on the table. The work was exhausting, but rewarding in ways I hadn't expected. There's something deeply satisfying about watching seeds you planted emerge from dark soil into green life. The connection to the land that my grandfather had tried to explain during those childhood summers was finally beginning to make sense. Jake had grown less antagonistic as the weeks passed. He still made his pointed comments, but they'd evolved from mockery into something closer to genuine advice. When my irrigation pump failed, he grudgingly lent me a backup unit while I waited for parts. "Don't read too much into it," he grumbled when I thanked him. "Can't have your dead crops contaminating my water table." But I caught him checking on my fields more than once, and his criticism had become more constructive. Perhaps he was beginning to realize I wasn't giving up as easily as he'd assumed. The local farmers' market became my testing ground for diversification. Mrs. Henderson suggested I try growing specialty vegetables alongside the corn, heirloom tomatoes, organic herbs, and unusual peppers that the restaurants in the county seat were seeking. The profit margins were better, and the work gave me something productive to do while waiting for the corn to mature. My first farmer's market booth was a disaster of overconfidence and poor planning. Half my tomatoes were overripe, my display looked amateur, and I sold maybe $20 worth of produce. But I watched the successful vendors, learned from their techniques, and improved each week. By August, I had regular customers asking specifically for my herbs and peppers. The extra income wasn't substantial, but it represented something more important, proof that I could make this work with creativity and persistence. September brought the busiest time of the year, harvest season. My corn had recovered better than expected from the spring replanting, and I was cautiously optimistic about breaking even for the year. The old John Deere had been running reliably for weeks, and I'd finally mastered its quirks and temperament. That's when overconfidence struck back. I was harvesting the north field, the section closest to Jake's property line, when I noticed the tractor pulling slightly to the right. Instead of stopping to investigate, I adjusted my steering and kept going. The mechanical groaning that followed should have been a warning, but I was focused on finishing before the weather turned. The steering linkage failed catastrophically just as I crested a small hill. The tractor veered sharply right, crashed through the fence separating my property from Jake's, and rolled down a steep embankment before coming to rest upside down in his irrigation ditch. I crawled out shaken but unhurt, staring up at the overturned machine that represented my only means of completing the harvest. The financial implications were immediate and devastating. No tractor meant no harvest, and no harvest meant losing everything. Jake appeared at the edge of the ditch within minutes, drawn by the crash. For a moment, he just stared at the wreckage, then at me covered in mud and looking defeated. "Well," he said finally, "that's one way to get my attention." His laughter started as a chuckle, but built into the kind of deep, uncontrollable mirth that comes from witnessing spectacular failure. He laughed until tears ran down his weathered cheeks, pointing at the absurd sight of my tractor's wheels spinning helplessly in the air. "City boy, finally learned to fly," he gasped between waves of laughter. I stood there dripping, watching him enjoy my disaster, feeling every ounce of dignity drain away, along with the muddy water from my clothes. This was it, the moment he'd been waiting for since I arrived. My inevitable, spectacular failure served up with perfect comic timing. The insurance adjuster delivered the verdict I'd been dreading. The tractor was a total loss. At 25 years old, with countless hours of hard use, its book value was barely enough to cover the deductible. I was left with nothing but a pile of twisted metal and the crushing realization that my farming operation was finished. Jake's laughter haunted me for days. Every time I walked past that ditch, I could hear it echoing across the fields. The other farmers in town had heard about the incident within hours, and I caught their sympathetic glances and whispered conversations whenever I showed up at the feed store or gas station. The harvest deadline was approaching fast. Corn left standing too long would dry out and lose value, but I had no way to bring it in. The custom harvesting crews were booked solid, and even if I could get on their schedule, the cost would eat up any profit from the crop. I spent a sleepless night running numbers on every scrap of paper in Grandpa's desk. Selling the equipment and livestock might cover my debts, but it would leave me with nothing to continue farming the following year. The 2-year requirement in Grandpa's will meant I had to keep operating until next fall or lose everything. My old college roommate called again, this time with a specific job offer: senior developer position, 6-figure salary, signing bonus that would clear my farm debts with money left over. All I had to do was admit defeat and walk away. "It's not giving up," he insisted during our long phone conversation. "It's being practical. You gave it a shot, learned some things about yourself, and now you're moving on to something you're actually good at." Nay, the reasonable voice in my head agreed with him completely. Farming was harder than I'd imagined, and I was clearly out of my depth. The smart move was to cut my losses and return to a world where I understood the rules. But something deeper than logic kept me sitting in that kitchen, surrounded by 3 generations of family history. Grandpa hadn't given me this land to be practical. He'd given it to me because he believed I could grow into something more than I was. Mrs. Henderson found me sitting on the porch the next morning, staring at the fields I couldn't harvest. She'd brought coffee and what she called practical advice, though her usual optimism seemed strained. "Your grandfather went through tough times too," she said, settling into the old rocking chair beside me. "Lost half his crop to drought in '88, had equipment fail right at harvest more than once, but he always found a way through." "He didn't have Jake Morrison laughing at his failures," I replied bitterly. She was quiet for a moment, then gave me a look I couldn't quite interpret. "Jake's got his own troubles, you know. That laughter might not mean what you think it does." Before I could ask what she meant, a car I didn't recognize pulled up the gravel drive. The woman who got out was dressed like a city professional, expensive suit, briefcase, the kind of polished appearance that spoke of serious business. "Mr. Peterson, I'm Sarah Chen from Midwest Agricultural Development Corp. I understand you're having some difficulties that might present an opportunity for both of us." I invited her in, curious despite my exhaustion. She spread documents across Grandpa's kitchen table with practiced efficiency, explaining her company's mission to develop sustainable farming operations throughout the region. "We've been watching your operation," she said. "Your diversification into specialty crops, your community education programs, your commitment to staying despite significant challenges, these align with our investment criteria." The offer was more complex than a simple loan. They wanted to partner with me, providing equipment and expertise in exchange for a percentage of future profits and first right of refusal if I ever decided to sell. It wasn't charity, but it wasn't pure business either. "Why me?" I asked. "There are dozens of more successful farms in the county," she smiled. "Because you're thinking differently. Traditional farming is facing huge challenges: climate change, economic pressures, changing consumer demands. We need partners who can adapt and innovate, not just do things the way they've always been done." The contract gave me 48 hours to decide. It would mean giving up some independence, but it would also mean surviving to farm another year. That evening, I walked the property lines, trying to think clearly about Sarah Chen's offer. The moon was full, casting everything in silver light, and I found myself at the spot where my tractor had crashed through Jake's fence. The wreckage was gone, hauled away by the salvage company, but the gouges in the earth remained. Something Mrs. Henderson had said bothered me about Jake having his own troubles. His operation looked successful from the outside, but I realized I'd never looked closely at the details. Farming was a business of narrow margins and constant risk, even for experienced operators. The next morning, I drove to the county courthouse to research property records. If I was going to potentially partner with an agricultural development company, I wanted to understand the local market better. What I found surprised me. Jake's farm was heavily mortgaged. Not just the normal operating loans that most farmers carried, but multiple liens and what looked like emergency refinancing. The records showed he'd borrowed against the property several times in recent years, always at higher interest rates than the previous loans. More digging revealed the pattern. Jake had expanded aggressively 5 years ago, buying expensive equipment and additional land right before commodity prices crashed. He'd been struggling ever since, robbing Peter to pay Paul, staying one step ahead of foreclosure through increasingly desperate financial maneuvers. The final piece of the puzzle came from an overheard conversation at the feed store. Two old-timers were discussing the Morrison family situation in the cautious way small-town people talked about their neighbors' troubles. "Bank's been patient so far," one said, "but that patience has limits. Jake needs something to change soon, or he'll lose everything his daddy built." Suddenly, Jake's interest in my property made perfect sense. He wasn't just a successful neighbor looking to expand. He was a desperate man who saw my inheritance as his potential salvation. The laughter when my tractor crashed hadn't been simple mockery. It had been relief that his primary competition for survival was self-destructing. That knowledge changed everything about Sarah Chen's offer. It wasn't just about my future anymore. It was about understanding the real dynamics of the agricultural community I was trying to join. Armed with new understanding, I approached Jake directly that afternoon. I found him in his machine shed, working on a combine harvester that looked like it had seen better decades. The frustration on his face, when he looked up, told me everything I needed to know about his mechanical troubles. "Come to gloat about something?" he asked, but without his usual edge. "Actually, I came to talk business," I replied. I've got a decision to make, and it affects both of us." I explained Sarah Chen's offer without revealing my knowledge of his financial situation. His reaction confirmed my suspicions. First surprise, then poorly concealed envy, then the calculating look of a man weighing options. "So the city boy's getting bailed out by corporate money," he said finally. "Must be nice having connections." "It's not a bailout," I corrected. "It's a partnership, and I'm thinking about turning it down." That got his attention. "You're what? Why would you?" "Because I've got a different idea. What if we pooled our operations? Your experience, my capital access, shared equipment and costs. We could both harvest our crops, reduce overhead, and maybe turn this into something bigger than either of us could manage alone." Jake stared at me like I'd suggested we start a circus. "Partner with you? The guy who just rolled his tractor into my ditch?" "The guy who's bringing agricultural development money to the table," I corrected. "Sarah Chen's company wants innovative partnerships. A collaboration between traditional farming knowledge and new approaches might be exactly what they're looking for." I could see him thinking, weighing pride against necessity. His combine was clearly on its last legs, and we both knew he couldn't afford to replace it. Meanwhile, I had potential access to modern equipment through the development company, but lacked the expertise to use it effectively. "What exactly are you proposing?" he asked carefully. "A formal partnership. We combine operations, share equipment and expertise, split costs and profits according to contribution, your land and experience, my development deal and fresh perspective. Both our farms survive and thrive." He was quiet for a long time, staring at his broken-down machinery. When he finally looked up, the hostility in his eyes had been replaced by something I'd never seen before, hope mixed with stubborn pride. "I'd need to see the details," he said finally, "and I'm not taking charity." "Neither am I," I replied. "This would be business." The next week was a whirlwind of meetings, phone calls, and legal documents. Sarah Chen was intrigued by the partnership proposal, especially when I explained Jake's 3 generations of farming experience and his deep knowledge of local conditions. Her company's model was built around exactly this kind of collaboration between traditional expertise and modern innovation. Jake proved to be a shrewd negotiator once he committed to the idea. His financial desperation hadn't dulled his business instincts, and he drove hard bargains on everything from profit-sharing formulas to equipment usage schedules. I found myself respecting his tenacity, even when it complicated the negotiations. The turning point came when we walked the combined properties together, mapping out the most efficient use of the land. Jake's knowledge of soil conditions, drainage patterns, and microclimate variations was encyclopedic. He could predict which fields would be ready for harvest first, where to expect problems, and how to maximize yield from every acre. "This section always drains poorly in spring," he explained, pointing to an area where I'd struggled with flooding. "But if you plant it 2 weeks later with a shorter season variety, it'll be your most productive ground." Your grandfather knew that, but somehow it didn't make it into his notes. For the first time, I understood the depth of what I'd been trying to learn through trial and error. Successful farming wasn't just about following procedures. It was about reading the land like a language, understanding the subtle signs and seasonal rhythms that books and videos couldn't teach. The legal structure we hammered out was complex but fair. Jake would contribute his land, equipment, and expertise to a new farming partnership. I would bring my property and the development company investment. Profits would be split based on land contribution and management responsibilities, with Jake taking the lead on traditional crop production while I focused on diversification and business development. Sarah Chen's company would provide modern equipment, technical support, and guaranteed markets for our produce. In return, they'd receive a percentage of profits and data about sustainable farming practices they could use to refine their development model. The contract signing was scheduled for Friday morning at the lawyer's office in town. By Thursday evening, We had agreements from all parties and what looked like a viable path forward for both farms. The night before the contract signing, I couldn't sleep. The magnitude of what we were about to do, combining two family operations that had been separate for generations, felt simultaneously exciting and terrifying. I walked out to the fields where everything had started, trying to process the journey from that first morning with Grandpa's deed to this moment of partnership. Jake was already there, standing at the fence line between our properties. In the moonlight, he looked older than his 50-some years, weathered by decades of physical labor and financial stress. "Having second thoughts?" I asked as I approached. "About the partnership? No. About other things." He was quiet for a long time, staring across the fields. When he finally spoke, his voice was different, less guarded, more human than I'd ever heard it. "I owe you an apology," he said finally. "The way I treated you when you first arrived, the laughing when your tractor rolled, that wasn't right. You were trying to honor your grandfather's memory, and I was scared." "Scared of what? Of losing everything my family built? Of having to admit that 3 generations of Morrison farming might end with me?" He gestured toward his property. "I'm leveraged to the hilt, have been for years. When you inherited this place, I saw it as my way out. Buy your land, consolidate operations, use the economies of scale to dig out of debt." The honesty was surprising, and I waited for him to continue. "When you stuck it out despite the setbacks, when you kept fighting instead of giving up and selling to me, part of me was angry, but part of me was impressed. Takes guts to keep going when everything's telling you to quit. You could have offered to help instead of hoping I'd fail," I pointed out. "Pride," he said simply. "Stupid, stubborn pride. Morrison men don't ask for help, and we sure don't offer it to competitors. My father would have called what we're doing tomorrow a betrayal of everything he taught me." "What do you call it?" He smiled, the first genuinely warm expression I'd ever seen from him. "Evolution, adaptation, survival." He paused. "Maybe even friendship, if you're willing to overlook a lot of bad behavior." Standing there in the moonlight, looking across the land we were about to farm together, I realized this partnership was about more than business success. It was about community, about the way people could grow and change when circumstances demanded it. "Tomorrow's going to be interesting," I said. "Best kind of farming," Jake replied. "Never boring." Oh, the contract signing went smoothly, with Sarah Chen expressing enthusiasm about the partnership model and its potential for replication across their development network. By afternoon, we were officially in business together. Morrison-Peterson Agricultural Partnership, with big plans and cautious optimism. The real test came during our first joint harvest. Jake's expertise combined with the new equipment from the development company created an efficiency neither of us could have achieved alone. We brought in both corn crops in record time, with yields that exceeded even Jake's optimistic projections. But the bigger success was watching Jake discover the potential in diversified farming. His initial skepticism about my specialty vegetables and farmers market operation evaporated when he saw the profit margins. By spring, he was suggesting expansion into organic certification and direct-to-restaurant sales. "City boy might know a thing or two after all," he admitted one evening, as we reviewed financial projections that showed both our operations not just surviving, but thriving. The transformation in our relationship became a model for the entire community. Other struggling farmers began approaching us about cooperation agreements, shared equipment purchases, and joint marketing initiatives. What had started as 2 desperate men trying to save their individual operations evolved into a network of mutual support that strengthened the entire regional agricultural economy. Mrs. Henderson loved to remind anyone who'd listened that she'd seen it coming all along. Takes a crisis to show people what they're really made of, she'd say. And sometimes what looks like failure is just the first step towards something better. Standing on my porch this morning, exactly 2 years after inheriting Grandpa's farm, I can see Jake working the east field with equipment that belongs to both of us now. The corn is shoulder high and healthy, the specialty crops are thriving, and our partnership has exceeded every projection Sarah Chen's company made in their initial assessment. I think Grandpa would be proud, not just of the successful operation, but of the community that's grown around it. The land is being farmed better than ever, but more importantly, it's brought people together in ways that strengthen everyone involved. Jake still laughs sometimes, but now it's usually at his own jokes rather than my mistakes. And when new farmers struggle with equipment failures or setbacks, we're the first ones to offer help instead of mockery. The tractor incident that seemed like a disaster was actually the beginning of everything good that followed. Sometimes, what looks like failure is just life clearing the path for something you never would have chosen, but desperately needed. Thank you for listening to this story of persistence, partnership, and finding unexpected paths to success. I'd love to hear from all of you. Please write in the comments where you're listening from around the world. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories about overcoming adversity and building community. Until next time, remember that sometimes our greatest failures are just the foundation for our most important victories.